Hello chess fans, this is Rick from Chess to Impress, continuing the series on the build-up, the countdown towards the Magnus Carlsen-Fabiano Caruana match for the World Championship in November in London. Only 76 days left now. Less than 11 weeks, it will be here before you know it. We continue looking at the 46 earlier World Championship matches and tournaments in the history of the official and undisputed World Championship. The Carlsen-Caruana match will be the 47th event. We've arrived at the Lasker-Capablanca match of 1921. José Raul Capablanca was born in Havana on Cuba on November 19, 1888, and he was a chess prodigy as a child. He made his international tournament debut at San Sebastián in Spain in 1911, and he unexpectedly won first prize there. 7 months later, he challenged the world champion for a title match. Lasker then proposed conditions that were unacceptable to Capablanca, and Capablanca issued a statement to which Lasker replied, "Capablanca aimed a deliberate blow against my professional honor," and then Lasker broke off the negotiations. That didn't work out. In 1912, Akiba Rubinstein challenged Lasker to a match, which was agreed upon, but it didn't happen because of the outbreak of World War I. And after the war, Rubinstein unfortunately had lost his financial backing for the match. Lasker himself was financially ruined after the war and accepted a challenge from Capablanca in 1920. And then something very strange happened. In June 1920, before the match was played, Lasker suddenly resigned the world title. But Capablanca did not want to become world champion this way, and a match was agreed. It was held in Havana in Cuba over 24 games with a $20,000 prize money fund. Lasker was 52 years old at the time and was suffering from the heat. Capablanca played in his own backyard. Here a bigger picture of both players, Capablanca on the left and the second world champion Lasker on the right. 24 games were scheduled, but only 14 were played. What happened there? As you can see, Capablanca won 4 games. Lasker did not manage to win any, and the score was 9 points to 5 after 14 games. 12.5 were needed to win the 24-game match, but here, after 14 games, Lasker resigned the match. He was exhausted. He could not play on. Capablanca was the third official and undisputed world champion. And what was very interesting is that after the match, both players talked about the danger of the draw death in chess. The fatal hour of this ancient game is approaching, they said, in 1921. So even back then they were talking about the game being on its last legs, that there would be too many draws at the top level. But as we know, almost 100 years later, our beautiful game is still very much alive. In this video, we're going to look at Game 5 from this match. Let's get into it. It was played on the 29th of March 1921. Capablanca was white, Lasker was black, and the challenger opened d4, d5. The score in the match at this moment was 2 points each. 4 draws were played in the first 4 games of the match. Knight f3 from Capablanca, knight f6 from the world champion, c4 and e6. We have a queen's gambit. Bishop g5, knight bd7, e3, the bishop was developed, the knight was developed, Lasker castled, rook to a central file, and here b6. Kasparov in his series My Great Predecessor says that c6 or a6 are objectively better, but Lasker played the b-pawn. Capablanca took in the center, e takes, and bishop b5 was Capablanca's choice in the first game of this match, but in game 5 he had prepared queen a4 instead. And c5 was played, and I found comments from Capablanca himself on this game. He said that this move is considered up to now the best answer for black, but I believe to have had the pleasure of finding over the board in this game the one way to knock it out. So it was not preparation. He found this over the board. The move is queen c6. That's how the refutation of the c5 move starts. White will end up with an extra pawn after this. The rook is hanging in the corner, so rook b8 was played by Lasker, and knight takes d5. Kasparov says that knight takes d5 from black here comes into consideration, but Lasker chooses a more complicated way. He played bishop b7, hitting the queen, and here's an in-between move. You have to save your knight, so knight takes e7 is check. Black has to take, and then the queen goes back to a4. White has got a pawn in the bag. Rook bc8 was Lasker's move, and Kasparov says this is too slow, and that Lasker should have taken on f3 instead, giving up that beautiful bishop. G takes, c takes, queen takes, knight e5, this is Kasparov's variation, bishop e2 and rook bd8, with the initiative and some compensation for the pawn for black. Rook bc8 was played and was too slow according to Kasparov. Queen a3, very nice move. It gets an exclamation mark from Kasparov, and Capablanca himself writes, "This move might be said to be the key of White's whole plan. The main point was to be able to play bishop to a6. And you cannot play bishop a6 straight away instead of queen a3, because then c takes d4 and you cannot take back because of the pin. The e-pawn is pinned. Queen a3 was played, and if you now take on d4, then you lose your queen on e7. And that was the idea of queen a3. So after queen a3, queen e6 was played by Lasker, and now bishop takes f6. Capablanca writes, this exchange had to be made before putting the plan into execution. Lasker took back with the queen, and now bishop a6 as planned. Kasparov says, with a series of accurate and strong moves, Capablanca has gained an obvious advantage. Here most of his opponents would not have lasted long, but Lasker, though pinned to the wall, only now begins to demonstrate his true strength. And the world champion is going to sacrifice an exchange. Bishop takes f3. Capablanca writes, Dr. Lasker thought for over half an hour before deciding on this continuation. It is not only the best, but it shows at the same time the fine hand of this master. An ordinary player would never have thought of giving up the exchange in order to keep the initiative in this position, which was really the only reasonable way in which he could hope to draw the game. Interesting comments from Capablanca and from Kasparov. Capablanca took the exchange, took on c8. Rook takes, the bishop was taking back, and queen takes pawn. White is an exchange up. The rook on h1 is hanging, so rook g1, and then rook e8. Here, an interesting variation is if you just take that pawn, if you're greedy, take the pawn on a7, then black gets a draw because of a very nice rook sacrifice. You have to take, queen takes, and if you go to d1, there is queen d3 check, king back with a move repetition. If after queen takes e3 check you go to f1, which is a bad move, then this rook is unprotected with check, and black is better. So after rook e8 you cannot take that pawn on a7. Queen d3, good move from Capablanca, and g6. King f1. Capablanca writes, the play here was extremely difficult. I probably did not find the best system of defense. I cannot yet tell which was the best defense here, but it is my belief that with the best play, White should win. Rook e4 was played by Lasker. Kasparov writes, by sacrificing an exchange, Lasker has gained definite counterplay instead of a hopeless position. But Capablanca is parrying the threats and retaining his extra material. It's a titanic struggle, this. Queen back to d1, offering a queen trade, but black does not want to trade queens being material down. He gives a check. Rook interposes. Knight f6. And here, rook g4 is a big threat. Black would then be winning. So king g1 was played on pinning the rook on g2. C takes d4, and here rook takes c4. And Lasker writes about this move, wonderful. Kasparov says an excellent defensive move, forcing a rook exchange as white threatens rook takes d4 now. If white instead of this wonderful move had played e takes d4, then there is knight d5, rook g3, queen back to e6, a variation that Kasparov gives, and this would have given black serious compensation for the exchange. White's rook's out of play, his king is exposed, he has many weaknesses, and h7, h5, h4 is coming, writes Kasparov. Rook c4 is a better move and was played by Capablanca. Lasker took on e3, rook takes rook, and now taking in between with check is not good, because of rook takes f2, you have to take back the rook, and then queen d8 check, king g7, and queen back to d4 with check. A double attack, winning the knight. So e takes f2 as an in-between move is not good in this position. Lasker saw that and he took back on e4 straight away. A check, king g7, queen back to d4 with check, but now the difference is that the knight can drop back to f6. F takes e3, queen e6, rook f2, and g5 to escape from the pin with king g6, as Kasparov writes. h4 from Capablanca, and Lasker took that pawn. Capablanca writes, this was Lasker's sealed move. This was move 31. They played sessions of 30 moves. It was not the best, says Capablanca. His chance to draw was to play king g6. Any other continuation should lose. Lasker took that pawn. It was taken back by Capablanca and knight g4. A check from white, king f8, and rook f5. Not the best. Rook d2 would have won, says Capablanca. The text move gives black a chance to draw the game. So after rook f5, h5 was played, protecting the knight and creating counterplay with the queen and the knight. If you take the pawn, then there is queen takes e3 check with counterplay. So queen d8 check was Capablanca's choice. Now we see a move repetition, king g7, queen check, king back, and once more, queen back to g5. And apparently the rule of claiming a draw when a position is appearing for the third time with the same player to move was not in operation yet in 1921. Otherwise, Lasker could have claimed a draw here, saying that he was intending to play king f8 with the same position on the board for the third time with the same player to move. But apparently that rule didn't exist yet. Here queen takes h5 is given by Kasparov as the best move, and he calls the move that was played in the game b3, a move from Capablanca made by eye, saying that Capablanca was unwilling to make a detailed calculation of dangerous variations, which he sees as a weak point of the third world champion. Queen d6 was played by Lasker, and if you now take that pawn, that's a big mistake, because of queen g3 check, and black takes over. Black is winning here. It's check, so if you go to f1 with your king, then there is knight takes e3 check with a fork, winning the exchange back, and you end up with an extra pawn in this queen endgame. King e2, knight takes f5. If after queen g3 check you don't go to f1 but to h1, then we get something similar. Another check, king g2, and there's that fork again. King h2, and we have won the exchange back with black. So after queen d6 you should not take on h5, and Capablanca didn't. He played queen f4. Black gave a check, queen interposed, queen d2, and now Capablanca took on h5. And that is very odd. I analyze this game, not only looking at Capablanca and at Lasker and at Kasparov's comments, but also with an engine, and the engine here screams at me saying that rook takes f7 check leads to a forced checkmate. And this was not noticed by Capablanca, well, you can forgive him because he didn't have an engine, but Kasparov also must have consulted engines when he wrote my great predecessors, but he does not comment that rook takes f7 check is a forced checkmate. Anyway, rook takes h5 was played, and knight takes e3, hitting the queen, queen f3, queen d4, and a check. Capablanca calls this not the best, and says that king h1 offered better chances of success. But Kasparov cannot find a winning plan for white after that move. Queen a8 check should also lead to a draw. And you cannot go to g7, because then you get checkmated. Queen h8 check, king g6, and checkmate. So Lasker went to e7. Queen b7 check. And here, if you play king e6, as Lasker says, this would have avoided the exchange of queens. And black is still fighting for a draw. But after queen d7 check, Lasker, he must have been tired at this stage. He made a blunder. He played king f8, and that decides the game on the spot. If you want to look for the refutation of that move, you can do so. I will give the move now. Because Lasker resigned the game after queen b8 check. Because he's losing the knight now in a forced way. Again, if you go to g7, there's the checkmate that we already saw on h6. So you have to go to e7 again, but then there is queen e5 check. You have to swap the queens, and this is a rook fork check, and the knight is attacked at the same time. King d6, rook takes, and white is a rook up, and will easily win this game. What an amazing game, what a rich game, and what drama at the end. Lasker fought like a lion, was still in the game, but then king f8 was a big blunder. This was the first decisive game of the match, as we saw Capablanca won 3 more, and then Lasker, exhausted, resigned the match, and Capablanca was the 3rd world champion. Capablanca would defend his world title 6 years later against Alexander Aljochin, and that's what the next video is about. Hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, please subscribe to the Chess to Impress channel, and please leave a comment. I will read them all and I will reply to them all. If you like this video, it would be great if you could share it on social media and with your chess friends. This is Rick for Chess to Impress. Thank you for watching.